He threw her out with nothing but the clothes on her back, convinced she was the anchor dragging him down. Brian Thorne had everything: the billions, the empire, and the younger, fiery mistress on his arm. He thought the past was buried, but tonight, amidst the clinking crystal of the city's most exclusive restaurant, the past didn't just walk in. It arrived in a convoy of power. When Brian looked up and saw his pregnant ex-wife, glowing and untouchable, holding the hand of the one man he feared in the business world, his heart didn't just stop. It shattered. This isn't just a story about heartbreak. It's a story about the kind of revenge that doesn't need to scream to destroy you. The chandeliers at l'Orangerie were not made of glass. They were made of diamonds. Or at least, that was the rumor Brian Thorne liked to spread. It fit his narrative. He was the man who turned sand into gold, the tech mogul who had risen from the gritty streets of Chicago to the penthouse suites of Manhattan. Tonight, Brian sat at the best table in the house, the one reserved for royalty and presidents. Across from him sat Chloe, a 23-year-old model whose beauty was as undeniable as her lack of conversation. She was scrolling through Instagram, her perfectly manicured thumb hovering over photos of herself. "Put the phone away, Chloe," Brian said, his voice low but sharp. "We're celebrating. The merger with Kincaid Logistics went through. I'm officially the majority shareholder." Chloe looked up, her blue eyes wide but vacant. "Oh, right. Yay, baby. Does that mean we can get the villa in Como now? The one with the boat dock?" Brian swirled his vintage Pinot Noir, feeling a familiar, dull ache in his chest. It was the ache of boredom. "We can buy the whole lake if we want," he muttered, though the thrill of saying it was gone. 6 months. That's how long it had been since he divorced Emma. Emma. The name still tasted like ash in his mouth. She had been his college sweetheart, the woman who darned his socks when he couldn't afford new ones, the woman who stayed up all night proofreading his first business plans. But as Brian's bank account grew, Emma remained simple. She liked quiet nights. She wore comfortable shoes. She didn't know how to charm investors or command a room. Brian had convinced himself that he had outgrown her. He needed a symbol on his arm, not a partner. So, he had done it brutally. He remembered the day vividly. He had handed her the papers and a check, telling her she didn't fit his future. She hadn't screamed. She hadn't thrown a vase. She had simply looked at him with eyes full of a devastating sorrow, whispered, "You will learn the price of this, Brian," and walked out into the rain. "Brian, you're spacing out," Chloe whined, tapping her fork against her wine glass. "I ordered the lobster, but the waiter is ignoring me." "He's not ignoring you. He's busy," Brian snapped, his patience fraying. Suddenly, the ambient noise of the restaurant, the soft jazz, the murmur of conversation, the clinking of silverware, died down. It wasn't a gradual silence. It was an abrupt, collective inhale. Brian frowned. L'Orangerie was frequented by celebrities daily. A hush like this meant someone truly powerful had arrived. "Who is that?" Chloe asked, craning her neck. "Is that a movie star?" Brian turned his chair slightly to look toward the grand entrance. The maitre d', a man named Pierre who usually looked down his nose at everyone, was practically bowing. 2 figures walked in, flanked by 4 security guards, who moved with the silent lethality of trained military personnel. The man was tall, standing well over 6'2", wearing a bespoke charcoal suit that probably cost more than Brian's first car. He had salt and pepper hair and a jawline that looked carved from granite. Brian froze. He knew that man. Everyone in the business world knew him. It was Adrian Vance, the CEO of Vance Global, the man who owned the shipping lines Brian used, the satellites Brian rented, and the banks Brian borrowed from. Adrian Vance was old money, dangerous money. He was a shark that even other sharks swam away from. But it wasn't Adrian who made the blood drain from Brian's face. It was the woman holding Adrian's arm. She was wearing a floor-length gown of emerald green silk that clung to her curves before cascading to the floor. Her hair, once usually tied back in a messy bun, fell in lustrous, polished waves down her back. She wore a necklace of sapphires that caught the light, blazing like blue fire. It was Emma. But it wasn't the Emma he knew. The mouse was gone. This woman walked with her head high, her gaze sweeping the room with a serene, terrifying confidence. And then Brian saw it. The silk dress was tailored perfectly to accommodate the undeniable round swell of her stomach. She was heavily pregnant. Brian's grip on his wine glass tightened so hard the stem snapped. Red wine spilled over the pristine white tablecloth, looking disturbingly like blood. "Oh my God, Brian, look what you did!" Chloe shrieked, jumping back to avoid the splash. Brian didn't hear her. He couldn't hear anything but the roaring in his ears. Pregnant? She was at least 7 months along. He did the math instantly. 6 months since the divorce. 7 months pregnant. The room seemed to tilt. The baby. Was it his? Or had she moved on that quickly? As the host led Adrian and Emma through the restaurant, they had to pass Brian's table. Brian felt paralyzed, unable to look away. He expected Emma to shrink, to look down, to hide. Instead, as they neared, Emma's eyes locked onto his. There was no fear in them. There was no love either. There was only a cold, polished indifference, like looking at a stranger on a subway. Adrian Vance placed a protective hand on the small of Emma's back, leaning in to whisper something in her ear. Emma laughed, a genuine musical sound that Brian hadn't heard in years. They breezed past him, leaving a scent of jasmine and expensive cologne in their wake. "Wait," Chloe whispered, eyes narrowing. "Isn't that your ex? The frumpy one?" Brian stared at the red stain spreading on the tablecloth. "Yes," he rasped, his voice sounding foreign to his own ears. "That's Emma." The waiter rushed over to clean the spill, apologizing profusely, as if it were his fault Brian had lost his composure. Brian waved him away irritably, his appetite completely gone. "I don't get it," Chloe said, picking at her bread. "You said she was broke. You said she was nobody. Why is she with him? That's Adrian Vance. My dad says Adrian Vance could buy this city if he wanted to." "I don't know, Chloe," Brian snapped, loud enough that a nearby couple glanced over. He lowered his voice, his fists clenching under the table. "I don't know." Across the room, Adrian and Emma were seated at the private alcove table, the one even Brian couldn't book. It offered a panoramic view of the skyline, but enough privacy to be discreet. Brian watched them like a hawk. He saw Adrian pull out Emma's chair. He saw the way the waitstaff hovered around them, treating Emma like a queen. But what ate at him the most was the way Adrian looked at her. It wasn't the look of a man with a trophy mistress. It was a look of total adoration, and the way his hand rested gently on her stomach when he sat down. That gesture felt possessive, protective, paternal. Is it his child? Brian's mind raced. Impossible. We were together 7 months ago. It has to be mine. But she never told me. A sudden surge of entitlement washed over him. If that was his heir, he had a right to know. He was Brian Thorne. He didn't get kept in the dark. "I'm going to the bathroom," Brian lied, standing up abruptly. "Don't take long," Chloe pouted. "I want dessert." Brian ignored her and walked across the dining room. He didn't go to the restroom. He walked straight toward the alcove. His heart was hammering against his ribs, a mix of anger and a strange, sudden desperation he hadn't expected to feel. As he approached, two large men in suits stepped out of the shadows, blocking his path. "Step aside," Brian demanded, trying to summon his CEO authority. "I'm an acquaintance." "Mr. Vance is not accepting visitors," one of the guards said, his voice flat and bored. "Let him through, Marcus," a deep voice called out from the table. The guards parted. Brian stepped into the alcove. Emma didn't even look up from her menu. She looked radiant, her skin glowing with pregnancy hormones, her cheeks flushed. She looked healthier and more beautiful than she ever had during their marriage. "Emma," Brian said, his voice tight. She slowly lowered the menu. Her hazel eyes met his, cool and detached. "Hello, Brian. I wondered how long it would take you to storm over here." "You're pregnant," he blurted out. "Observant as always," she replied, her tone dry. "Is it—" Brian glanced at Adrian, who was watching him with an amused, predatory smile, sipping his scotch. Brian looked back at Emma's stomach. "Is it mine?" Emma let out a short, incredulous laugh. "Yours?" "Brian, you gave up the right to ask that question the night you threw me out of our home at 11 p.m. because I lacked vision." "If that is my child, I have rights," Brian hissed, stepping closer. "I have lawyers who can—" "Sit down, boy," Adrian Vance spoke. He didn't shout. He didn't stand up. He just spoke, and the command in his voice was so absolute that Brian actually stopped mid-step. "Mr. Thorne," Adrian continued, swirling his drink, "you seem to be under a few misconceptions. Let me clear them up. First, do not raise your voice at my fiancée. It upsets the baby." "Fiancée?" The word hit Brian like a physical blow. "Second," Adrian said, his eyes hardening into steel, "regarding the paternity. You were so busy chasing your— What is she? An Instagram model? You were so busy chasing her during the last year of your marriage that you barely touched your wife. We both know the timeline, Brian. Don't embarrass yourself by pretending you were a present husband." Brian's face flushed red. He looked at Emma, searching for a crack in her armor. "Emma, tell him. Tell him who I am." "I told him who you were, Brian," Emma said softly. She placed a hand on her belly. "I told him you were the man who made me feel small, so you could feel big. I told him you were the man who said I was worthless." She reached out and took Adrian's hand, and then Adrian showed me that I was priceless. "You're with him for the money," Brian spat, his ego fracturing. "That's it, isn't it? You traded a millionaire for a billionaire. You're just a gold digger, Emma." The air in the alcove dropped 10 degrees. Adrian set his glass down. The sound was quiet, but it echoed like a gunshot. "Careful," Adrian whispered. "You are speaking to the chairwoman of the Vance Foundation, and unlike you, Brian, she didn't inherit her worth or steal it. She built herself back up from the ruin you left her in." At that moment, Chloe, having grown impatient, clattered over to the table in her high heels. She looked between the three of them, sensing the tension, but lacking the intelligence to read the room. "Babe, what's taking so long?" Chloe whined, grabbing Brian's arm. She looked at Emma and sneered. "Oh, it's you. Wow, you got fat. I guess the divorce didn't agree with you." The silence that followed was deafening. Emma didn't get angry. She smiled, a slow, pitying smile. "And you must be Chloe." Brian always did have a taste for things that sparkle but have no value. Chloe gasped. "Excuse me?" "You can have him," Emma said, turning back to her menu. "I've already discarded him. But a word of advice, dear. Check the prenup. Brian is very protective of his pennies." Adrian chuckled darkly. "Get them out of here, Marcus. They're ruining my appetite." The security guard stepped forward, their bulk imposing. "This isn't over, Emma," Brian snarled as the guards ushered him back. "You can't hide my child from me. I will destroy you in court." Adrian Vance stood up then. He towered over Brian. He leaned down, his voice a low rumble near Brian's ear. "If you try to sue her, if you try to harass her, if you even look in her direction again, I won't just sue you, Brian. I will buy your company, strip it for parts, and leave you with nothing but that cheap suit on your back. Do not test me." Brian retreated. He had no choice. He walked back to his table, Chloe chirping in his ear about how rude they were. But Brian couldn't hear her. He sat down, staring at the empty chair where his future should have been. He looked at Emma, laughing with a billionaire, carrying a child that might be the heir to 2 empires. And for the first time in his life, Brian Thorne felt small, but the night was far from over. As Brian signaled for the check, desperate to escape, he saw a man in a grey suit approach Adrian's table. It was a process server. Brian paused. Was Adrian being served? No. The man walked past Adrian and headed straight for Brian's table. "Brian Thorne?" the man asked. "Yes." "You've been served," the man said, dropping a thick envelope on the table right next to the wine stain. Brian tore it open, his hands shaking. It wasn't a lawsuit from Adrian. It was a lawsuit from Emma. Plaintiff, Emma Vance Cross. Subject, intellectual property theft regarding the Thorne algorithmic model. Brian's blood ran cold. The algorithm, the code that had made him his first billion. The code he claimed he wrote, the code Emma had written for him in their college dorm room 10 years ago. She wasn't just back for revenge. She was back for everything. The morning sun hit the glass walls of Brian Thorne's corner office, but it brought no warmth. The air inside was freezing, conditioned to a sterile chill that matched the mood of the 3 men sitting around the mahogany conference table. Brian sat with his head in his hands. Opposite him was Marcus Sterling, his chief legal counsel, a man who usually cost $500 an hour to look bored, but today looked genuinely terrified. "Tell me this is a joke, Sterling," Brian muttered, sliding the lawsuit across the table. "She was a literature major. She proofread my emails. She didn't write the damn code." Sterling adjusted his glasses, sweat beading on his forehead. "Brian, we've had the forensic IT team look at the source code of the Thorne algorithmic model, the foundation of your entire platform. They found something buried in the kernel. Hidden metadata." "And?" Brian snapped. Sterling tapped a key on his laptop, projecting an image onto the wall screen. It was a string of complex code, but hidden within the syntax were comments, notes written by the programmer. For Brian. "So you can finally sleep tonight. Love, E." Brian stared at the screen. The memory hit him like a physical blow. It was 7 years ago. He had been on the verge of failing his finals, his code crashing every time he ran it. He had passed out from exhaustion on their futon. When he woke up, the code was fixed. Emma had been sitting there with a cup of coffee, smiling tiredly. She said she fiddled with it. He had assumed she just fixed a typo. He hadn't realized she had rewritten the entire architecture. "It gets worse," Sterling said, his voice dropping. "The lawsuit claims that the copyright for this specific architecture was registered by her under a pseudonym, Ghostwriter, 3 days before you launched. She owns the IP, Brian, and she's filing for an immediate injunction to shut down your servers until a settlement is reached." "Shut us down?" Brian stood up, knocking his chair over. "If the servers go down for an hour, our stock drops 10%. If they go down indefinitely, Thorne Tech is bankrupt within a week." "Then you need to settle," Sterling said grimly. "Give her whatever she wants. Money, shares, an apology. Because if this goes to court, She has the digital receipts, and she has Adrian Vance's legal team behind her. They will bury us. Brian walked to the window, looking out at the city he thought he owned. His phone buzzed. It was Chloe. Text. Babe, my credit card got declined at Gucci. Fix it ASAP. People are staring. Brian threw the phone against the wall. It shattered. He couldn't lose his company. He was Brian Thorne. He was a genius. He wasn't a fraud who rode his wife's coattails. Where is she? Brian asked, turning back to Sterling. She's hosting the Silver Gala tonight at the Metropolitan Museum, Sterling replied. It's a fundraiser for single mothers. Tickets are $20,000 a plate. Get me a ticket, Brian ordered. Brian, if you approach her, violates the restraining order. I said get me a ticket, Brian roared. I'm not going to harass her. I'm going to remind her that she loved me once. Emma is soft. She's emotional. If I can just get her alone, away from Vance, I can talk her down. I can make her drop this. Sterling looked doubtful, but he picked up his phone. I'll try. But Brian, she doesn't look soft anymore. The Metropolitan Museum was transformed into a glittering wonderland of silver and white. The city's elite, politicians, heirs, tech moguls, drifted through the halls, champagne flutes in hand. Brian entered alone. He hadn't brought Chloe. He needed to look serious, repentant. He wore his most conservative suit, but he felt like an imposter in his own skin. Every whisper he heard seemed to be about him. Did you hear about Thorne Tech's stock dip today? I heard Vance Global is acquiring a massive stake in a new competitor. Brian pushed through the crowd, his eyes scanning for the emerald green dress. He didn't see green tonight. He saw silver. Emma was standing on a raised platform near the Temple of Dendur, speaking into a microphone. She wore a silver maternity gown that shimmered like liquid moonlight. She looked regal, untouchable, a queen addressing her subjects. And that is why the Vance Foundation is pledging $50 million to legal aid for women who have been wrongfully dispossessed in divorce settlements, Emma said, her voice clear and strong. The crowd erupted in applause. Brian felt a knot of nausea in his stomach. The fund was a direct shot at him. As Emma stepped down, surrounded by admirers, Brian made his move. He maneuvered through the crowd, ignoring the glares of people he had snubbed in the past. "Emma!" he called out, just as she was about to be whisked away by her security. She stopped. The crowd around them parted, sensing the drama. It was the showdown everyone had been gossiping about. Emma turned slowly. Adrian was not by her side for once. He was across the room speaking with a senator. This was Brian's chance. "Brian," she said, her expression unreadable, "you bought a ticket. That's generous. I assume the $20,000 is an advance on the alimony you owe me." Use of the word alimony made a few people chuckle. Brian stepped closer, lowering his voice to a desperate whisper. "Emma, please. We need to talk. Privately." "I have nothing to say to you that can't be said in front of a judge," she replied coolly. "It's about the company," Brian pleaded. "You're going to destroy it. Do you have any idea how many people will lose their jobs? I know you're angry at me, but don't take it out on my employees. That's not who you are. You're kind. You're the woman who saves stray cats." Emma's eyes flashed. "The woman who saved stray cats died the night she slept in her car because her husband cancelled her credit cards." The crowd gasped. Brian paled. He had hoped no one knew about that. "I didn't know you had nowhere to go," he stammered. "I thought you went to your parents." "My parents are dead, Brian. You knew that. You just didn't care." She took a step closer to him, her voice dropping to a lethal whisper. "And as for your company, it's not your company. It's built on my code, my sleepless nights, My genius. You were just the face, Brian. And now I'm taking the mask off. Emma, wait, Brian said, reaching for her hand. What about the baby? If you destroy me, you destroy his inheritance. That child, he's mine, isn't he? Deep down, you know he needs his father. Emma looked down at Brian's hand on her arm, then back up at his face. She didn't pull away. She smiled, but it was a smile that didn't reach her eyes. You want to know about the baby, Brian? Yes, he breathed, thinking he had found an opening. I have a right to know. Okay, she said, her voice loud enough for the nearby circle to hear. The night you kicked me out, I had a gift box in my hand. Do you remember? Brian frowned, thinking back. Yes. She had been holding a small white box. He had knocked it out of her hand in his rush to get her out the door so Chloe could come over. I remember, he whispered. Inside that box was a positive pregnancy test and a pair of tiny booties, Emma said, her voice trembling slightly with suppressed rage. I tried to tell you. I tried to say, Brian, we're having a family. And you looked at me and said, take your trash and get out. Brian felt the blood drain from his face. The room spun. So don't stand here and pretend you care about fatherhood, Emma hissed. You abandoned your child before he was even born. And now? Now he has a father. A real man who held me while I cried, who went to every ultrasound, who built the nursery with his own hands. It's not the same, Brian argued weakly. Biology matters. Biology makes you a donor, Brian. Love makes you a father. Suddenly, a heavy hand landed on Brian's shoulder. It was Adrian Vance. He had crossed the room in seconds. Is there a problem here? Adrian asked, his voice calm but terrifyingly deep. We're just talking, Brian said, trying to shrug off the hand. He couldn't. Adrian's grip was like iron. It looked like you were upsetting my wife, Adrian said. She's not your wife yet, Brian spat, his jealousy flaring again. Adrian smiled. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He tucked it into Brian's breast pocket. Read that when you get outside. It's a copy of the adoption papers. I legally adopted the child in utero 2 weeks ago, with Emma's full consent and the court's approval, due to proven abandonment by the biological progenitor. Brian stared at him, mouth agape. You can't do that. I'm Adrian Vance, he said simply. I can do anything. Now get out of my sight before I have security throw you down the front steps. Humiliated, defeated, and with the eyes of New York's elite burning into his back, Brian turned and fled. He stumbled out into the cool night air of Central Park. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the paper Adrian had given him. It wasn't just adoption papers. It was a DNA test result attached to the back. Subject, Brian Thorne. Result, 0% paternity probability. Brian froze. He read it again. 0%? He frantically scanned the document. Then he saw the medical note at the bottom. Note. Subject has a congenital condition rendering him sterile. Condition likely present since adolescence. Brian dropped the paper on the sidewalk. He wasn't the father. He had never been the father. He couldn't be a father. But if he was sterile, and Emma was pregnant, then who was the father? And then the realization hit him. The timeline. The business trips Emma had taken alone a year ago to the West Coast, where Vance Global's HQ was. She hadn't met Adrian 6 months ago. She had known him before. The rain in New York didn't wash things clean. It just made the grime slicker. Brian stood on the sidewalk outside the specialized fertility clinic on the Upper East Side, the heavy oak door closing behind him, with a finality that echoed in his bones. He had gone there demanding answers, threatening to sue the clinic for malpractice, screaming that the DNA test Adrian gave him was a forgery. The doctor, an elderly man with zero patience for billionaires throwing tantrums, had simply pulled Brian's file from 20 years ago, a file from when Brian was hospitalized for a severe case of mumps complications as a teenager. "I told your parents then, Mr. Thorne," the doctor had said, adjusting his spectacles. "The damage was total. You have never been able to father children. We assumed you knew." Brian walked blindly through the rain, his expensive Italian leather shoes splashing into puddles. He hadn't known. Or maybe, deep down, he had ignored the signs. For 5 years, he had blamed Emma. Every month her period came, he would sigh, look at her with disappointment, and make a subtle comment about her clock ticking. He had made her feel broken. He had sent her to specialists, forced her to take hormones that made her sick, and shamed her when nothing happened. And the whole time, the broken one was him. He hailed a cab, his hands shaking. He needed to go home. He needed to explain to Chloe that... Chloe. The realization hit him. Chloe was only with him because he promised her the world. He promised her a dynasty. If she found out he was shooting blanks, and that his company was on the verge of collapse, she would be gone before the morning news. He arrived at his penthouse soaking wet. The place was a mess. There were shopping bags everywhere. Chanel, Hermes, Prada. Chloe was on the sofa, surrounded by open boxes, shouting into her phone. "I don't care if the card was declined. Run it again. Do you know who my boyfriend is?" She looked up as Brian entered, dripping on the marble floor. "Ugh, finally. Brian, fix my black card. It's embarrassing me." Brian looked at her, really looked at her. She was beautiful, yes, but it was a plastic, hollow beauty. There was no warmth in her eyes, only hunger. "Chloe," he said, his voice hoarse, "pack your bags." She laughed, a sharp, brittle sound. "Excuse me? Are we going to Paris?" "No," Brian said, walking over and kicking a Chanel box across the room. "You are leaving. Get out." Chloe stood up, her face twisting into a sneer. "You can't be serious. You think you can just toss me out like you did your ex-wife?" "My ex-wife," Brian said, the words tearing from his throat, "was worth 10 of you. She built me. You just bleed me. Get out, Chloe. I'm done paying for your company." "Fine," she shrieked, grabbing a handful of jewelry from the table. "You're boring anyway. And for the record, Brian, everyone laughs at you. You think you're a king, but you're just a walking wallet. And I heard about the lawsuit. You're going to be poor, Brian, and poor doesn't look good on you." She stormed out, slamming the door so hard the walls shook. Brian was alone. He poured himself a drink, staring out at the city lights. He had destroyed his marriage for a woman who didn't love him. He had lost the only person who had ever truly believed in him. But then, the sadness turned into something darker. A cold, malignant anger began to rise. Emma knew. She must have known. If she was pregnant now, and the baby wasn't his, and he was sterile, that meant she had cheated. The timeline nagged at him. Divorced 6 months. Pregnant 7 months. She had slept with someone while they were still married. Brian laughed, a low, manic sound. The Saint Emma. The woman who pretended to be so perfect. She was an adulteress. He grabbed his phone. He dialed a number he hadn't used in years, a slimy tabloid journalist named Barry who owed him a favor. "Barry," Brian said, his voice smooth and dangerous. "I have a scoop for you. The real story behind the Adrian Vance and Emma Cross romance. How the billionaire stole another man's wife, and how Saint Emma was carrying a bastard child while still sleeping in her husband's bed." "That's dynamite, Brian," Barry said, practically salivating. "But can you prove the timeline? The baby is the proof, Brian lied. "Run it. Burn her reputation to the ground. If she wants to sue me for my company, I'll make sure she's too ashamed to show her face in court." Brian hung up. He felt a twisted sense of victory. If he was going down, he was taking everyone with him. The headline the next morning was brutal. Billionaire's baby scandal. Did Adrian Vance steal his pregnant mistress from a heartbroken husband? The article painted Brian as the victim, a hard-working husband blindsided by a cheating wife who seduced a richer man to climb the social ladder. It insinuated that the baby was a product of an illicit affair carried out in Brian's own home. Brian sat in his office, watching the social media storm. The public opinion was shifting. People were calling Emma a gold digger. They were questioning Adrian's integrity. "This will force a settlement," Brian told Marcus Sterling, who looked ashen-faced. "They'll drop the lawsuit to make the bad press go away." "Brian," Sterling said, looking at his tablet, "you need to see this. Vance Global just called a press conference. They're streaming live." Brian spun his chair to the giant screen on the wall. There was Adrian Vance, standing at a podium. He didn't look rattled. He didn't look angry. He looked like an executioner. Next to him stood Emma. She wasn't hiding. She looked straight into the camera, her expression fierce. "This morning," Adrian began, his voice rumbling through the speakers, "a desperate man tried to use the media to bully a pregnant woman. Brian Thorne has accused my fiancée of infidelity. He has accused me of breaking up a happy home." Adrian paused, then looked directly into the lens. "We anticipated this, because liars always assume everyone else is lying." Adrian stepped aside, and Emma took the microphone. "I did not cheat on Brian Thorne," she said clearly. "I was a faithful wife for 7 years. I supported him when we had nothing. I wrote the code that made him a billionaire while he slept." She held up a document. "This is a medical report from the Mayo Clinic, dated 8 months ago, 1 month before Brian divorced me. It confirms that I underwent a singular round of IVF treatment using a donor." Brian froze. "IVF? "I did this," Emma continued, her voice wavering slightly, "because my husband was desperate for an heir, but refused to see a doctor himself. I wanted to surprise him. I wanted to give him the family he claimed he wanted. I paid for it with my own savings. I went through the injections alone." A hush fell over the room in the video, and over Brian's office. "I found out the procedure was successful the day Brian served me divorce papers," Emma said, a tear finally escaping. "I tried to tell him. He didn't listen. He threw me out. I was pregnant, homeless, and alone. That is when Adrian Vance found me. He didn't steal me, Brian. You threw me away. He just picked up the treasure you were too blind to see." Adrian stepped back to the mic. "As for the business, Mr. Thorne seems to have forgotten something about the ghostwriter architecture he stole." Brian's stomach dropped. "Emma didn't just write the code," Adrian said with a dark smile. "She protected it. There is a fail-safe embedded in the kernel, a kill switch. It was designed to trigger if the unauthorized user, Brian, tried to tamper with the core files, which, according to our logs, his IT team did this morning in an attempt to hide the evidence of theft." Adrian looked at his watch. "The kill switch activates in 3, 2, 1. In Brian's office, the lights flickered. Then, the humming of the servers in the building died. Brian's computer screen went black. "Sir!" His assistant burst into the room, hysterical. "The platform is down! The app is down! Everything is offline! The code! It's just gone! It's deleting itself!" Brian frantically pounded on his keyboard. Nothing. Just a black screen with green text blinking in the corner. "Error. User unauthorized." "Goodbye, Brian. On the TV screen, Adrian Vance leaned in close to the microphone. Thorn Tech is now effectively a shell company with zero assets. The stock is currently in freefall. I have already contacted the SEC to hand over evidence of Brian Thorn's embezzlement of company funds to pay for his mistress's lifestyle. Adrian's eyes were cold as ice. Checkmate, Brian. The feed cut. Brian sat in the silence of his dead office. His phone began to ring. It was the board of directors, then the SEC, then the bank. He didn't answer. He walked to the floor-to-ceiling window and looked down at the streets of Manhattan. He had wanted to be a king. He had wanted to be feared. He had gotten his wish. He was feared, as a cautionary tale. He watched as a black SUV pulled up to the curb far below. He saw a tiny figure in a green coat get into the car, helped by a tall man. Even from this distance, he could see the care in the man's gesture. Emma. She had won. She hadn't just defeated him. She had erased him. Brian sank to the floor, the silence of the empty office pressing in on him like a physical weight. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the old crumpled photo he had kept in his wallet for years, a photo of him and Emma in their college dorm, eating pizza on the floor, laughing. They had been poor, but he had looked happy. He realized now, with the crushing weight of total ruin, that that moment was the richest he had ever been, and he had traded it all for a diamond chandelier that wasn't even real. 3 years is a long time in the world of business. In 3 years, startups rise, empires fall, and names that once dominated headlines are swept into the dustbin of history. But for Brian Thorn, 3 years felt like 3 centuries. The fall hadn't been quick. It hadn't been the clean, swift execution he had hoped for when the screen in his office went black. It was a slow, agonizing dismantle. The SEC investigation dragged on for 18 months, a public flaying that stripped him of every layer of dignity he possessed. They took the penthouse first, then the cars, then the art collection. He remembered the day the marshals came for his watch collection. He had stood there, watching a man in a cheap windbreaker handle his Patek Philippe, the one he bought when he made his first 10 million, and toss it into an evidence bag like it was a plastic toy. That was the moment Chloe left. She didn't even pack a bag. She simply called an Uber, looked at him with eyes devoid of anything resembling love, and said, "You're bad for my brand, Brian." Now, 3 years later, Brian stood shivering on the sidewalk of East Wacker Drive in Chicago. The wind off the lake was a physical assault, a biting, wet cold that seeped through the thin fabric of his polyester uniform. He wasn't Brian Thorn, the tech mogul, anymore. He was Jules, the bottom-rung valet at the Grand Plaza Hotel. "Hey, Jules, wake up!" The shout came from Manny, the 20-year-old valet captain who spent most of his shift vaping and checking TikTok. Manny didn't know who Brian used to be. To Manny, Brian was just the quiet, grey-haired guy who was too slow on the sprint and too shaky with the keys. "I'm awake," Brian muttered, stomping his feet to get the feeling back in his toes. His cheap black shoes were leaking. The slush from the street had soaked his socks hours ago. "Big night tonight," Manny said, blowing a cloud of strawberry-scented smoke into Brian's face. "The Future of Tech Gala. We got VIPs coming out the ears. Don't scratch anything, old man. These cars cost more than your life." Brian flinched. The Future of Tech Gala. 5 years ago, he had been the keynote speaker at this very event. He remembered the applause. He remembered the feeling of the spotlight, hot and blinding, as he pontificated about vision and disruption. He remembered Emma sitting in the front row, her hands folded over her lap, looking at him with a pride he hadn't deserved. She had worn a simple blue dress that night because he had told her the designer gown she wanted was too flashy. Tonight, he wasn't the keynote. He was the help. The doors of the hotel swung open, spilling golden light and the sound of jazz onto the snowy pavement. The scent of expensive perfume and roasted meats wafted out, a cruel reminder of the hunger gnawing at Brian's stomach. He had skipped lunch to save $5 for the electric bill. The guests began to filter out. Brian recognized faces. There was Marcus Sterling, his old lawyer, laughing with a new client. Sterling looked right through Brian as he handed over a ticket stub for a Mercedes. Brian took the ticket, his head bowed low, the brim of his cap hiding his eyes. He fetched the car, accepted a $2 tip without a word, and watched Sterling drive away. It was a special kind of hell, being invisible in a world where you used to be a god. "Heads up!" Manny hissed, straightening his jacket. "We got a whale coming in. Private driver, blacked out Escalade. That's the Vance detail." Vance. The name hit Brian like a taser. His breath hitched in his throat. He wanted to run. He wanted to fake a heart attack, retreat into the break room, dissolve into the concrete. Anything but be here. But he couldn't move. His feet were frozen to the pavement, rooted by a mixture of terror and a sick, masochistic curiosity. The massive black SUV pulled up to the curb, flanked by 2 security vehicles. It didn't look like a car, it looked like a fortress on wheels. The engine hummed with a low, powerful vibration that rattled Brian's teeth. "Jules, get the door!" Manny barked, busy flirting with a socialite in a fur coat. Brian stepped forward. His hands were trembling so badly he had to clasp them behind his back for a moment to steady them. He approached the rear passenger door. He saw his own reflection in the tinted glass, a gaunt, hollow-cheeked man with grey stubble and eyes that looked haunted. He looked 20 years older than 35. He reached out and pulled the heavy handle. The door swung open, and warmth spilled out. The smell of leather, cedar wood, and jasmine. The first thing he saw was a shoe, a polished, handmade Italian Oxford. Adrian Vance stepped out. Time had been kind to Adrian. If anything, the years had only added to his presence. He was broader, his salt and pepper hair cut in a sharp, military style. He moved with the easy grace of a man who owned the ground he walked on. He didn't look at the valet. He turned back to the car, extending a hand. "Careful, love. It's icy." A hand took his. It was a hand Brian knew better than his own. He knew the shape of the fingers, the curve of the wrist. He knew how that hand felt when it smoothed his hair back when he was sick. He knew how it felt when it scrubbed dishes in their first tiny apartment. Emma stepped out. Brian felt the air leave his lungs. She was magnificent. The mouse was gone. The woman standing before him was a queen. She wore a floor-length gown of deep crimson velvet that hugged her figure, topped with a white coat that looked like soft snow. Her hair was styled in loose, glamorous waves, and diamonds sparkled at her throat. Not the gaudy, flashy kind Chloe used to demand, but elegant, timeless stones. But it wasn't the clothes, it was her face. The lines of worry that had defined her during their marriage were gone, replaced by a serenity that made her glow. She looked rested. She looked loved. "Wait for me!" A small voice chirped from inside the car. Brian froze. A little boy, no older than 3, scrambled to the edge of the seat. He was bundled up in a miniature navy peacoat and a red scarf. He had dark, curly hair and bright, inquisitive eyes that scanned the world with wonder. Adrian laughed, a deep, booming sound that Brian had never heard directed at him. "We didn't forget you, Leo. Come here, champ." Adrian scooped the boy up effortlessly, settling him onto his hip. The boy giggled, wrapping his small arms around Adrian's neck. "Did you see the robot, Daddy?" the boy asked excitedly. "The one with the lasers?" "I did," Adrian replied, kissing the top of the boy's head. "But I think you liked the dessert table better." "I like cookies," Leo declared solemnly. Emma laughed, brushing a snowflake off the boy's nose. "You are definitely your father's son. A sweet tooth and an eye for lasers. Your father's son." The words echoed in Brian's head, bouncing around the empty cavern of his soul. Your father's son. Leo wasn't Brian's. He could never be Brian's. The DNA test had been the final nail in the coffin of Brian's ego. He was sterile. He was a genetic dead end. All his talk of legacy, of a dynasty, of the Thorn name. It had all been a farce. The real legacy was standing right in front of him. A happy, healthy child raised by a man who hadn't needed to demand respect to earn it. Brian stood by the open door, paralyzed. He knew he should close it. He knew he should step back, fade into the shadows. But he couldn't look away from the boy. Leo had Emma's nose. He had Emma's smile. Suddenly the boy looked at him. Leo's eyes locked onto Brian. The child didn't see a failure. He didn't see a bankrupt fraud. He just saw a man in a funny hat standing in the snow. "Hi," Leo said, waving a mittened hand. The sound of the boy's voice shattered Brian's composure. Tears pricked his eyes, hot and sudden. He tried to speak, to say hello, but his throat had closed up. Emma turned. She followed her son's gaze. Her eyes landed on the valet. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. The snow fell silently around them. The city noise faded away. Then, recognition dawned. It wasn't dramatic. She didn't gasp. She didn't clutch her pearls. Her eyes simply widened a fraction. She took in the cheap uniform, the wet shoes, the grey hair, the badge that read Jules. Brian braced himself. He expected her to sneer. He expected her to laugh. He expected her to tap Adrian on the shoulder and say, "Look, darling, look at the trash." He almost wanted her to. He deserved the anger. Anger would mean he still mattered, even negatively. But Emma didn't get angry. Her expression softened. Her shoulders dropped slightly. She looked at him with a profound, crushing sadness. It was the look you give a stray dog that has been kicked too many times to be approachable. It was pity. Pure, indifferent pity. She didn't say his name. She didn't acknowledge their past. She didn't ask him how he was. She simply turned her head back to her husband and son. "It's freezing, Adrian," she said softly. "Let's get Leo inside the jet. He's shivering." "Right away," Adrian said. He turned to Brian. Adrian didn't recognize him. To Adrian Vance, Brian Thorn was a footnote, a minor antagonist in the first chapter of his life with Emma. He was so insignificant that he didn't even register as familiar. "Good service," Adrian said, his voice brisk but kind. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a bill. He pressed it into Brian's hand. "Stay warm," Adrian said. Brian looked down. It was a crisp, new $100 bill. Benjamin Franklin stared back at him, mocking him. "Thank you, sir," Brian whispered. His voice was a broken rasp, unrecognizable even to himself. Adrian nodded and turned away, guiding his family toward the private entrance of the hotel where their car would take them to the airfield. "Bye-bye," Leo called out over Adrian's shoulder, waving his mitten again. Brian raised a shaking hand and gave a small, weak wave back. "Bye," he mouthed. He watched them walk away. He saw Adrian lean down and whisper something to Emma, and he saw Emma lean her head onto Adrian's shoulder. They moved as a unit, a solid, unbreakable circle of warmth and love. They were a family, and Brian was just the man who opened the door. As the heavy glass doors of the hotel closed behind them, cutting off the view, the silence of the street rushed back in. The wind howled, whipping around the corner of the building. Brian looked at the $100 bill in his hand. In his old life, he would have used this to light a cigar. He would have tipped a waitress this much just for bringing him water. He would have laughed at the insignificance of it. Now this piece of paper was the difference between eating and starving. It was the difference between heat and freezing. He gripped the bill tightly, his knuckles turning white. A sob built in his chest, a jagged, painful thing that he couldn't suppress. He leaned back against the cold stone of the hotel wall, sliding down until he was crouching on the wet pavement. He had spent his life building a fortress of money to keep people out, thinking that made him strong. He had treated people like assets, liabilities, and commodities. He had thrown away the only woman who had ever loved him for free, all because he wanted a reflection that looked better in a magazine. He had wanted to be a king. And now he knew the truth. Kings are just men in costumes. The real power wasn't in the crown. It was in the hand you held when the snow started to fall. Emma had found a hand to hold. Brian had nothing but his hands in his pockets. "Yo, Jules!" Manny shouted from the booth, oblivious to the wreckage of the man on the ground. "Stop counting your tips. We got a Corolla pulling up. Move it!" Brian wiped his face with the rough sleeve of his jacket. He took a deep, shuddering breath. The cold air burned his lungs, grounding him. "Coming," he croaked. He stood up. He smoothed his cheap, oversized jacket. He put the $100 bill, his ex-wife's husband's charity, into his pocket next to his bus pass. He walked toward the battered Corolla, pulling up to the curb. He opened the door, forced a smile onto his face, and bowed his head. "Welcome to the Grand Plaza," Brian whispered. "How can I help you?" And that, my friends, is the cold, quiet end of Brian Thorne. There were no explosions, no jailhouse brawls, just the slow, freezing realization that he was the architect of his own misery. He spent a lifetime chasing value, but never understood worth. He threw away a diamond because he wanted glitter, and by the time he realized his mistake, the diamond was part of someone else's crown. It's a brutal lesson in karma. Sometimes the punishment isn't what happens to you, but what doesn't happen to you. Brian didn't get the family, the love, or the legacy. He just got the tip. I want to hear from you in the comments. That look Emma gave him. The pity. Do you think that was worse than if she had screamed at him? Is indifference the ultimate revenge? And if you were Emma, would you have said something to him? Or did she do the right thing by walking away? Let's get a debate going down below. If this story gave you chills, please hit that like button. It helps the YouTube algorithm share these stories with more people. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a drama. Thanks for watching, and remember, be careful who you step on while climbing the ladder, because you might have to look them in the eye on your way down.